There's a lot that's happened over the last 2 weeks. What I like to hone in on is the events in Kenosha, Wisconsin that began with the shooting of an unarmed Black man named Jacob Blake. And then 2 days later, during protests and civil unrest in the city, a 17-year-old white male with an AR-15 shot 3 people, killing 2 of them. So honestly, we could spend the entire evening discussing and dissecting what's happened in Kenosha. We could analyze the way that it's reverberating around the country. We could talk at length about the larger implications of unfair policing, the lack of racial justice, the murder of George Floyd, everything that came after that, the Black Lives Matter movement in general. But for now, I want to just narrow our scope. We're all veterans. We have significant firearms training. In that training, we learned explicitly that guns have the capacity, in fact, that they are designed to take human life. This is particularly true with the guns that we utilized in combat, like the M4 carbine, which is essentially the same as an AR-15. And in the military, we practice protocols that begin with the safe handling of firearms, and they end with ultimate accountability for the results of the discharge of our weapons. That includes accountability all the way up the chain of command. Simply put, we don't arm ourselves unless we're prepared physically, mentally, and emotionally to kill someone. Some of you may have heard me use this exact reasoning to explain why I actually don't own a gun in my home for protection. I often tell folks that I've been to combat, at which time I was prepared to take a human life, and I no longer consider myself prepared to meet that task. So I keep a Louisville Slugger by my bedside as a way to potentially protect my family in the rare event of a break-in or something similar. But beyond that, I'm not a hunter, I'm not a gun collector, so I have no real reason to own a gun. So it's my assumption that Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old alleged murderer in Kenosha, thought that he was prepared to kill someone that night. By virtue of him openly carrying a loaded semi-automatic assault rifle amidst a crowd of protesters, and the fact that the gun was meant as a deterrent against property destruction, he knew that the occasion to use the weapon to take a human life was potentially likely. Now, as a minor, he broke the law in Wisconsin just by carrying a deadly weapon in the open. And despite the fact that he's only 17 years old, this is not a boy. He's old enough to enlist in the military. He claimed to be a member of a militia. He had apparently deputized himself as a first responder of sorts, claiming to be both a protector of property or a police or a property and a medic. And at some point during the night when things got confusing, he pulled his trigger multiple times with ultimate consequences for himself and the 2 men he killed. The fact that he was armed elevated any argument or altercation he might encounter into a life or death scenario that could play out in just a millisecond. For those of us who have been to combat, that should sound like a very familiar scenario. A man threw a plastic bag at him, a gunshot rang out in the distance, and in an instant, 36-year-old Joseph Rosenbaum was shot in the head and left bleeding out as Rittenhouse ran away. Next, in a separate incident, he tripped. A man raised a skateboard to him, and this gunman swiftly and irrevocably issued a death penalty verdict and execution to 26-year-old Anthony Huber, and then shot another man. Rittenhouse, as we know, has been charged with, as an adult, has been charged with first-degree intentional homicide. He faces life in prison. And that, to some degree, is accountability under the law. We'll see what happens at the trial eventually. Now, to tie this back to Rustin Shesky, who's the police officer who shot Jacob Blake, I first want to mention that he and Rittenhouse are very different people, and these are very different situations. Rittenhouse was a vigilante with no right to be armed or even, and no right to even be on the street that night after curfew. Shesky was an officer sworn to protect and serve and was justifiably armed in that capacity. But inasmuch, he should have understood that his firearm had the ability to take human life. Just as we were prepared to kill when we armed ourselves in combat, so a police officer should take very seriously the lethality of his or her firearm. Yet this officer chose his gun as the method by which he applied his will to a citizen. He had many other options. He could have used his voice, a taser, or other non-lethal force, his physical strength, other officers. He could have just let Jacob Blake drive away. that would not have been the worst outcome. We nearly saw the worst outcome, and instead, Jacob Blake is now paralyzed. Look, we could add a whole bunch more nuance to this discussion of military fetishism, militias, open carry loopholes, police use of force, etc. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I just wanted to remind all of us as veterans that we know implicitly the potential lethality of a loaded firearm, and we should expect American gun owners to have that same understanding, especially law enforcement officers. Simply put, guns kill and guns kill quickly. So how can we, as veterans, help Americans grasp this concept?